when I have that picture.
Oh, that's a great idea that you sent me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
July 29th was the first one.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I'm
So
going to have
birthday.
cantaloupe when I'm in Nashville.
Yep. That's the plan. I have to load it up.
All right.
I've planted twice as many plants this year. So with the idea that maybe we might get actually twice as many harvests.
All right. On with the show. Now I'm going to be dying until August. All right. So we proceed with the Splendid Blonde Beast, Chapter 7, titled No Action Required.
Everybody please repost the space.
Yes, thank you, Bridget, for reminding me, and everyone else. This starts off with, like George F. Kennan, state specialists discounted reports of Nazi atrocities, attributing those massacres that could not be ignored to the random violence of war. The new measures that the Nazis had publicly initiated were regrettable, they said, but were not a matter in which the U.S. government wished to interfere. George Kennan. The leaders of this informal grouping at the State Department included the Chief Administrative Officer, Assistant Secretary Breckinridge Long, the Chief Advisor on Political Affairs, James Clement Dunn, Wartime Ambassador and Political Advisor Robert Murphy, Under Secretary of State Joseph Grew, again a name that comes up often, Legal Affairs Chief Green Hackworth. Now, by the end of this book, you guys are going to have heard me talk about Hackworth a zillion times, and you're going to think that he is an evil, you know what, because he is. He was, the Chief Legal Affairs. Soviet and Eastern European Affairs, Lloyd Henderson, a name that has also come up. European expert H. Freeman Matthews. European Division Assistant Chief John Hickerson. Jewish Affairs Specialist R. Borden Reams, Reams, and other senior staffers, including Eldridge Durbrow, Durbrow. Each made his own interpretation of wartime events, of course, but taken together, these men came to the core of a faction within the U.S. government whose conception of national security led them to deny the Holocaust, obstruct efforts to rescue any victims, and later to oppose trials for senior Nazi Germany leaders. This is largely due to the implications, as I've repeated often, of what it would mean to the United States. On October 25th, 1941, just prior to the U.S. entry into the war, the Nazis' execution of prisoners in France led President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill to make an unusual joint public condemnation of German atrocities. Within 3 months, 9 European governments in exile in London established an inter-allied conference on punishment of war crimes. Now, this is going to come up often in the next little bit. Inter-allied conference on the punishment of war crimes, and issued its first public statement on the prosecution of Nazi criminals of war. This declaration of St. James, as it became known, accused Germany of creating in occupied countries a regime of terror that was characterized as imprisonment, mass expulsions, executions of both hostages and POWs and civilians. Despite the tough language, the declaration was silenced concerning those that were the central target of Nazi prosecution, the Jewish population. The earlier protests from Roosevelt and Churchill had also sidestepped mention of this issue. When, let's see, one of the members, I was trying to figure out what this guy's first name is. Macon, Makin, Roger is his first name. Roger Macon was getting at, when he spoke about this during one of the planning meetings, he reasoned too much attention to this issue by the Allies would surely increase pressure on Britain to loosen its immigration policies for the Jewish people to Palestine. In fact, the pressure was already building from Jewish organizations at home and abroad. The Foreign Office had traditionally pursued a hard line against Jewish immigration to Palestine and was terrified that this would change that. As Franklin Roosevelt put it, about an Arab uprising against British if it was permitted to increase. This concern was heightened by the situation in North Africa, where British troops were seeking a breakthrough against Rommel's forces, and Germans were trying to coax the Arab leaders to attack the Allies. Second, and equally important, there was a controversial matter of how to go about ending the war. There was no doubt at the British Foreign Office that Germany must be defeated, but it was considerably less clear in 1942 exactly what the terms might be. Foreign Office and the War Office documents of this period reflect the assumption that there would not be an unconditional German surrender, but rather that Germany would likely retain control of a substantial portion of occupied territories, and there would be a negotiated peace agreement. That assumption was tied up with what was probably the single most explosive strategic issue of the war, the possibility of a separate peace agreement between the different allies, perhaps on terms that would permit the Germans to continue the war against the Soviet Union. This is called posturing. The hard line on war crimes, particularly one that insisted on international trials for senior members of the German government, would inevitably undermine any British efforts to negotiate an armistice. Finally, a tough British declaration on this issue might lead to German war crime trials of English prisoners of war. The Germans had announced that they considered the British bombing of German civilians in defenseless cities a war crime as well. Western legal experts were prepared to concede that they might be right. Hitler's government threatened to prosecute and hang British aviators if the bombings continued. They adopted a strictly legalistic approach to the issue that narrowed the definition of war crimes as much as possible. The British diplomats' approach was the legal concept of war crimes should be limited to a handful of specific acts that might typically be perpetrated by individual soldiers acting outside of orders, such as torture or summary execution of POWs. The Allies' public promises to track down Nazis and bring them to justice was used for propaganda. It might also lead to humiliation for the Allies, like that which had followed World War I, where German war crime suspects had evaded virtually all punishment. It would enlarge the scope of international law to a degree that the British government might find itself on the docket for its own imperialist crimes. Also, to avoid making inflammatory promises of justice that England was not going to keep, their spokesman by the name of Eden, E-D-E-N, limited his comments. Eden's comments at the St. James ceremony carefully separated British policy from that of the rest of the Allies. While welcoming the declaration, the foreign minister made pains to point out that the promises of punishment were an Allied and not a British policy. In Washington, D.C., the State Department officials responsible for monitoring conditions inside Nazi occupied Europe sweated through the summer of 1942 at their ornate headquarters just down the street from the White House. In late July, only 6 months after the Wannsee Conference, the State Department again received word of systematic use of gas facilities. German industrialist Edward Schultz had smuggled new information concerning the murders into Switzerland and arranged to have it delivered to both the US and the UK. The State Department European Division was the first office in the US to receive this news. It made little impact on those that received it. Eldridge Durbrow and R. Borden Reims were convinced that Hitler's mistreatment of Jews was limited to forced labor and petty persecution. Schultz's message was a wild rumor, they said, and refused to transmit the intelligence to Roosevelt. They didn't even transmit it to Secretary of State Cordell Hull, Hull. Durbrow cited the fantastic nature of the allegation and the impossibility of it being true as the reason why it wasn't forwarded. R. Borden Reims was at that moment engaging in burying a second document, which was a letter from the U.S. Embassy in London concerning a British proposal to create a joint Allied commission for the investigation and persecution of Nazi war crimes. British Parliament leaders had been pushing for an open debate on this issue. Great Britain, it said, should open Palestine to the Jewish refugees. Anthony Eden was intent on heading off any consideration of these measures. He referred to them as radical. He told U.S. Ambassador John Winant, W-I-N-A-N-T, of his dilemma, explaining that he would not be able to hold off a public debate much longer. He needed a quick U.S. approval of a paper war crimes commission to give him some ammunition to use once Parliament began to have these discussions. When it wired to Washington asking for prompt White House approval, ended up on R. Borden Reims' desk. Reims strongly opposed drawing any further attention to this issue. However, and an international commission would do just that. He tucked the telegram away in files without responding to it and didn't give it to the White House. The initiative for the Joint Allied Commission on Atrocities, which would eventually become the United Nations War Crime Commission, can be traced to a campaign backed by influential journalist Walter Lippmann and organized in large part by former League of Nations executive Arthur Sweetser, Sweetser. In late June 1942, Lippmann and Sweetser approached U.S. Assistant Secretary Adolf Berle, B-E-R-L-E, with a series of suggestions on how to respond to the massacres early that month in Czechoslovakia, where the SS had murdered 199 Czech men and boys in retaliation for the assassination of SS Chief Reinhard Heydrich. Lippmann and Sweetser proposed to attack the Nazi terror by exposing similar incidents to the intense glare of publicity, but military reprisals against Germany for crimes against civilians by a public promise to try Germans for these crimes once the war was over, and by the creation of a central depository in the UN to collect evidence for this was a worrisome issue for them. Allied intelligence service and underground movements throughout the Nazi-occupied territories should systematically send evidence to this depository. Littman and Sweetser contended where a thorough judicial committee would examine each case and prepare it for trial after the war ended. I think you guys can see where this is going. Both Littman and Sweetser had participated in the Paris negotiations. Littman as a leading member of the U.S. intelligence organization known as the Inquiry, and Sweetser as a member of the U.S. government press bureau in Paris. At the time, both had specialized in the use of propaganda and psychological warfare in international affairs, and now both were convinced that tough, consistent psychological operations focusing on Nazi atrocities would undermine the Nazis' public support, contribute to Hitler's eventual downfall, and save lives in the meantime. Burrell liked the proposal. He did not think that the new commission and the associated publicity would end Nazi terror altogether, but he did think that they could use it. Littman and Sweetser forces appear to have made a nearly identical approach to Churchill when the prime minister met with Roosevelt in Washington, D.C. in late June. He proposed a United Nations Commission on Atrocities in language almost identical to what Burrell had seen. FDR agreed with Churchill's remarks, and the prime minister returned to London with an agreement in principle to go ahead and quickly implement the UN plan. When Eden was suspicious of the commission's plan from the beginning, he sought to use it to derail a more substantial effort that was being floated around in Parliament. Eden referred to recent papers by legal experts at the Foreign Office and War Office stating that however dreadful the Nazis' actions might be, they were not recognized as crimes under international law to be dealt with and punished by a court. That was the War Office's official position. Further, the punishment of senior German leaders would be better determined at the end of the conflict when it could be a bargaining chip during negotiations. Despite Eden's opposition, the cabinet agreed in principle to back the Commission on Atrocities that had been outlined in the Churchill-Roosevelt meeting. The details of this new organization's responsibility and of its role in the Allied psychological war were to be hammered out by a special subcommittee that would meet later that month. It was Eden, however, who dominated the subcommittee, and by the time the proposals were made, it became ensnarled in bureaucratic contradictions and red tape. The subcommittee first dropped the recommendation that Allied intelligence agents report of evidence of war crimes to a central commission would happen. Instead, fewer than a dozen commission clerks would be assigned to collect evidence of Nazi war crimes throughout Europe and to report to each Allied country's courts and national war crimes investigators. The new group was perhaps to make recommendations on how to deal with the captured war criminals. Eden's charter read, but at the same time, any suggestions of some sort of international court for the trials of war crimes should be frowned upon. The new charter stressed that it was neither necessary nor desirable to create a new body of law for war crimes. Back in Washington, the State Department legal advisor, Green Hackworth, lobbied to limit any international action on war crimes to the creation of a fact-finding body. You know, just tell everybody what happened and don't do anything about it. Kind of like our congressional commissions and investigations here. Hackworth preferred that nothing be done to bring public attention to the question of whether or not most Nazi war crimes should be prosecuted as war crimes. He advocated a new name for the proposed commission, the United Nations Commission for the Investigation of War Crimes, to underscore the fact that it was an information gathering role only. However, there was a lot of outside agitation to do something more significant. The Soviet government was not consulted in any of this, even though they were one of the major allies who had suffered the most at the hands of the Nazis. October 7, 1942, British War Cabinet Minister Lord Simon announced the first formal initiative against Nazi crimes by the major Western allies, the formation of the United Nations Commission for the Investigation of War Crimes. It later was renamed the United Nations War Crimes Commission. Its responsibilities, he said, would center on naming and identifying the persons responsible for Nazi atrocity, and in particular for organized atrocities. Conspicuously absent from Lord Simon's announcement was any indication of how the commission's fact-finding task force was to be carried out. The new commission thus existed in limbo without any officers, structure, funding, staff, or anything but a mission. The commission sidestepped the explosive question of whether war crimes against civilians inside Axis territory was going to be considered a war crime. In fact, however, the killings were not covered by the commission's mandate, that of the civilians anyway. At least not as far as the British Foreign Office was concerned. 2 days after October 7th's announcement, the secretary of the Jewish Aid Committee for Immigrations in Zurich, Leon Rosengarten, wrote to the Foreign Office seeking clarification from Lord Simon. Is it to be understood, he said, that cruelties and massacres of stateless persons who formerly were German, Austrian, Romanian are included in its new commission inquiries? The British reply was vague and non-committal. The truth was that Eden's Foreign Office staff regarded the commission as a means of erecting a procedural roadblock to the actual prosecution of Nazis. Roger Allen of the Foreign Office staff commented in an internal correspondence spurred by Rosengarten's letter that this question was surely too big for the commission. It is nothing less than a question of indicting Nazi internal policies during the whole period of the regime. Yeah, kind of. It was difficult to envision an appropriate tribunal for bringing Nazis to trial for crimes against these people, he continued. Further, because Jews did not represent a separate nationality of their own, as he put it, it would be inappropriate for Jewish people as such to be represented directly on the commission. By coincidence, it was at that moment that Adolf Hitler chose again to discuss the treatment of German Jews during a radio address, almost like he knew what they were talking about. He was explicit. To my Reichstag speech of September 1st, 1939, announcing the German invasion of Poland, I have spoken of two things. First, that now that the war has been forced upon us, no array of weapons and no passage of time will bring us to defeat. And second, that if Jewry should plot another world war to exterminate the Aryan peoples of Europe, it would not be the Aryan peoples which would be exterminated, but the Jews. At one time, the Jews of Germany laughed at my prophecies, Hitler continued. I do not know whether they are still laughing or whether they have lost all desire to laugh. But right now, I can only repeat they will stop laughing everywhere, and I shall be right also in that prophecy. Berlin radio boasted about Germany's progress in dealing with the Jewish question, although the cover story remained that Jews were being deported for forced labor and not killed. The radio announced that Western Poland would be Jew-free, that's a quote, by December 1942. The occupation government of Holland pledged to deport all Jews by June of the following year. Germans had given Romania until December 1943 to remove theirs, although, as a U.S. diplomat report from London put it, quote, if the transportation go on at present rates, the Romanian government will have fulfilled those orders before then, unquote. In all parts of Europe, the Germans are calling meetings or issuing orders to bring about what they call the final solution of the Jewish problem, Ambassador Winnett cabled to Washington. Meanwhile, Polish intelligence operatives working out of Switzerland provided a remarkably detailed accounting of the exterminations and the slave labor program based on their penetration of the labor office in Warsaw. Quote, the most convincing truth of the liquidation of Warsaw Ghetto, they stated, quote, lies in the fact that for September 1942, 130,000 ration cards were printed. For October, the number issued was only 40,000. British sources in London also made public an accurate account of the deportations that specifically identified the death camps of Treblinka, Belzec, and Sobibor, the very existence which were supposedly among the most guarded secrets of the Reich. As London and Washington maneuvered, teams of Allied lawyers pieced together two activist committees that redefined war crimes issue to cope with the unprecedented scope of Nazi atrocities. These were unofficial, semi-private organizations, and their recommendations were not binding on Allied governments. Yet their work was crucial because it clarified the complex issues surrounding war crimes and established as early as the summer of 1942 a number of influential jurists in Europe and in the United States had concluded that the conventional interpretation of international law was not only ineffective against Nazi war crimes, but actually provided an atmosphere where they could prosper. At Cambridge University, the long-standing, relatively conservative International Commission for Penal Reconstruction and Development established a committee to deal with the legal questions involved in putting Hitler, Nazi officials, and their collaborators on trial. 10 prominent European jurists volunteered for the task. 7 of them would later represent their respective countries on the United Nations War Crime Commission. The Cambridge group recognized that although an ordinary person could readily understand the importance of prosecuting a particular Nazi responsible for, say, the murder or by starvation of thousands of Polish, it was quite another matter, actually, to bring that German to trial in an organized system of justice. In addition to the challenges of collecting evidence and establishing culpability that are part of any criminal proceedings, there were at least 2 more basic problems they saw. First, there is the question of whether these acts violated any existing law. And second, which court, if any, had jurisdiction to judge the crimes. These problems were particularly knotty in situations where Nazis had legalized their acts of persecution by announcing laws and decrees that ordered the deportation, compulsory labor, and seizure of property. Further, some mass murders of civilians appeared to be technically legal under existing international law. If the Germans could claim the killings came in response to guerrilla activities that had been specifically banned by earlier Hague conventions. The Cambridge Commission soon discovered that there was no clear authority for any court to try Nazis for any of the atrocities against civilians that had become the hallmark of the German rule in occupied countries. For example, after the war, civil courts in the Netherlands could presumably try Nazis for their collaborators for conventional crimes such as murder, rape, robbery that had taken place in the Netherlands. But the Cambridge group was not certain whether the Nazi deportation of Dutch Jewish people and resistance fighters to concentration camps was actually against Dutch law, particularly since the Nazis had legalized that and had basically claimed the Dutch territory as their own. Dutch courts also might not have the necessary jurisdiction over acts that the Nazis uh, perpetrated against Dutch civilians outside of the Netherlands, such as those that were sent to slave labor camps. Even if the Dutch courts did have jurisdiction, it was unlikely they would be able to force German authorities to turn over anyone to them. None of the Allied countries considered it proper to extend their national laws to offer protection to civilians inside of Germany or the other Axis countries. As for international law, the prevailing conception of national sovereignty gave the government of Nazi Germany and the Axis states virtually unlimited authority over their own population. Jewish people and so-called stateless refugees in Germany, Austria, Hungary, Italy, and Romania enjoyed no real protection under existing international law from persecution by the governments of those countries. The same was probably true for civilians in Nazi puppet states like Vichy France, Slovakia, and Croatia, though in those cases there were at least some grounds for a legal debate. Thus, Germans and German companies involved in forced labor inside of Germany seem to be immune from prosecution, in their opinion. German courts did have jurisdiction over crimes that took place inside of Germany and over some types of crimes committed abroad by German nationals, but there was little hope at Cambridge that German courts would be capable of rising to the challenge. The possibility of using Allied military courts to try Nazi criminals presented other problems. Military courts of several of the occupied countries apparently lacked authority to try civilians at all. And in other countries, they could try only those crimes that had been a direct relationship to the military and not civilians. Thus, the Nazi systematic persecution of Jews and others trapped inside of Axis territories appeared to be legal in their opinion. Meanwhile, a second private committee attempted to articulate solutions to the problems of the Cambridge group. They were identified as the London International Assembly, a 29-member offshoot of the old League of Nations. Little is remembered of the London Assembly today, but in about a year's time, during 42 to 43, the group sketched out much of the legal and theoretical foundation for the work of the UN War Crimes Commission and for the international trials at Nuremberg. Many of the innovations in international law and even in international affairs that were formalized at Nuremberg were the first fully articulated by this London group. A number of its more prominent members were members of the Cambridge group, including Justice Marcel de Beer of the Belgian Court of Appeals, The legal advisor to the French provisional government, René Cassin, Cassin, and Minister of Justice, Victor Bolson of Luxembourg. The U.S. members was one of the most distinguished criminologists of his generation, Harvard University, Dr. Sheldon Glueck, Glueck. The London International Assembly met in strict secrecy. Its purpose was to determine whether the activities of Nazis were then widely known, launching war in Europe, deporting civilians, systematic persecution of people on the basis of race and religion should be prosecuted as violations of international law rather than of national law of the different countries. These were many related questions. Does international law apply inside of Nazi Germany and other Axis states? Should Nazis be acquitted if they had been acting under orders when they were commanded to commit a crime? And what if particular actions, the summary execution of civilians who resisted German orders to evacuate their homes, for example, had been authorized by German law at the time they were committed? Was that too international crime? For many people, the debates over these points might seem to be absurd technicalities when measured against the carnage that had been left. In time, the London International Assembly put together substantial legal arguments. First, the group contended that the Axis decision to launch a war in Europe was an international crime, specifically a violation of the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928, to which Germany and most of the Allies, though not the United States, had pledged not to wage war on one another. Next, the London Assembly came out firmly in favor of creating a new international criminal court to try not only those cases that were outside the jurisdiction of national courts, but also cases involving crimes that had been legalized by the Nazis inside of Germany. This new court's proposed jurisdiction specifically included crimes against Jews and stateless persons. Mere terminology or technicalities should not obscure the main issue, the London Assembly argued. Coloring their crimes under a cloak of apparent legality should not help the Nazis escape justice. The Assembly also helped pioneer the legal definition of what came to be known as crimes against humanity by advancing the controversial concept that the men at the top of the German government who had conceived and framed the plans of aggression, racial extermination, systematic terrorism, mass murder, deportation, economic looting, and the establishment of concentration camps had violated such fundamental precepts of humanity that they had to be put on trial. Next came the issue of responsibility of heads of state for the actions of the countries they led. The prevailing legal doctrine of which the United States had been the leading champion was that head of state could not be put on trial in any international forum for the activities of his government, even if its action had, in the case of Hitler's Germany, disregarded the fundamental laws of mankind. Many experts contended that this de facto immunity for a head of state should be broadly interpreted. As some lawyers saw things, the field marshal of an army where war crimes had become routine practice could not be put on trial unless he personally ordered the soldiers to commit them. The London Assembly unanimously rejected this mainstream interpretation. In another important departure from the conventional wisdom, the group found that leaders were indeed responsible for the acts their subordinates took on. Finally, there was a problem of transferring captured war criminals from one jurisdiction to another, commonly called extradition. The Assembly agreed that it was possible for war criminals to exploit technical imperfections in legislation of the various Allied countries in order to find refuge, and that formal extradition process was so slow and cumbersome that it could not handle thousands of cases in an effort to prosecute Nazi war criminals would inevitably involve. Therefore, the Assembly suggested ordinary extradition should be reversed for ordinary criminal cases, while new procedures should be adopted to handle suspected war criminals. The Allied countries should formally agree to transfer accused war criminals to one another without the usual extradition hearing, while any peace treaty with the Axis powers should force them to turn over any suspects. These Assembly's conclusions were based in large measure on Sheldon Gulick's writing and arguments. Gulick contended that international law should not be regarded as fixed and unchanging, nor should it reduce to simple measures that countries had previously agreed to a treaty or not. For one thing, technology advances in war making had made obsolete many of the specific protections for civilians and soldiers written into early international law and treaties. Similarly, a criminal regime was unlikely to agree to treaties that made its own activities illegal. If the international community waited for criminal regimes to declare their own actions improper, there would be no international law at all. Back at the State Department in Washington, Durbrow and Reams believed that they had put the lid not only on the new intelligence from Europe about Hitler's genocide, but also the British proposal for a joint Allied war crimes commission. The two men apparently believed that they could continue more or less indefinitely to respond to news of Nazi atrocities by filing them away. Durbrow tried to shut down reports of the Holocaust that were now beginning to arrive with disturbing regularity from American embassies in Europe. He targeted Switzerland first, where the information from the German industrialist Schultz had originated. He attempted to bar the U.S. legation there from using the State Department's telegraph network to send any further messages of atrocities, unless they had conducted a thorough investigation. There was no reason to believe these fantastic reports. They were just opinions. But in late November 1942, Assistant Secretary of State Sumner Welles returned from a journey to Europe and confirmed to American Jewish leader Rabbi Stephen Wise that the evidence of systematic extermination of Jewish people was inescapable. It confirms and justifies your deepest fears, Wise recalls Wells as saying. The same evening, Rabbi Wise called a press conference in Washington. He reported that a presidential envoy had confirmed reports concerning Nazis' systematic execution in Warsaw and their efforts to wipe out all Jewish people in Europe. Wise also stated that the Nazis were paying bounties on corpses to be processed into commodities such as soap, fats, and fertilizer. R. Borden Reams at the State Department seized upon Wise's chilling claims concerning human soap and fertilizer in an attempt to undermine the rabbi's credibility. Within hours after Wise's appearance before the press, the State Department issued a statement distancing itself from Wise and refusing to back up his contention that Hitler was exterminating Jewish people. Reams and Durbrow and their counterparts in the British Foreign Office discredited and undermined every new report coming out of Europe. Shortly after the Wise press conference hit the news, the Foreign Office sent a note to British news media acknowledging that the government was soft pedaling the whole thing as much as possible for the minute, though they denied the media's suspicion that the Foreign Office was trying to kill the story altogether. A corresponding series of later notes can be found in US files, and they use remarkably similar language that was used in the UK. There, State Department political officer A.E. Clattenburg confirms that the department's press chief, Michael McDermott, made suggestions and recommendations to the United Press News Service in New York that atrocities should be soft pedaled. But the story was out in the wake of the Wise press conference. There was a rush of public attention to Nazi atrocities, but there was little agreement about what should be done about them. The most obvious response, the rescue of them and the other civilians in Romania and other victims, was also the least palatable politically, owing to fears in Washington and London that the anti-Semitic and anti-communist backlash if Jewish immigration to the West increased. Soon, the British Foreign Office hit upon a plan of offering the tough verbal protest that would, for the first time, stress Nazi persecution of the Jewish people. Like earlier measures, the intent here was to present the image of taking action against atrocities in order to avoid other substantial steps. So talk big and do nothing. Sounds so familiar. The early drafts of the new protest was quite hard-hitting. The US, Britain, and Soviet Union each acknowledged that the reports from Europe leave no room for doubt that the Nazis were now carrying out the intentional extermination, both in all of their territories. Poland, it said, had become a slaughterhouse. The ghettos are being systematically emptied of all Jewish people. None of those are taken away are ever heard from again. The strongest among the deportees were worked to death. The draft declaration continued, while the weak were deliberately massacred or left to die from exposure. Reims again sought to block any official statement on this issue. Quote, I have grave doubts in regard to the desirability of issuing a statement of this nature, he said. The atrocity report were unconfirmed and largely based on information from Schultz, he said. Publication of the protest as it stood would, quote, support Rabbi Wise's contention of official confirmation from the State Department sources. The way will then be open for further pressure from interest groups for action which might affect the war effort, unquote. In obvious reference to the growing demands for immigration relief, a statement of this kind can have no good effect and may in fact induce even harsher measures towards the Jewish population. Reims intervened with the British Foreign Office as well. Quote, no one questions that Jewish people of Europe were being terribly oppressed, and undoubtedly great numbers of them were being killed in one way or another, he said. He told the counterparts in London that issuing a protest would be a mistake because the US and British would thereby expose themselves to increased pressure from all sides to do something specific to help the people. It was better to say nothing at all, he contended. The maintenance of official doubt concerning the reality of Hitler's genocide seems to have been crucial to Reims in order to accommodate the European Division professional task, which consisted in an important part of denying visas to Jewish refugees. So the US was supporting the Brits in that denial. He insisted that the phrase noting that there was, quote, no room for doubt, unquote, concerning the Nazi extermination campaign had to be deleted. The problem, as he expressed it in memos, was that Jews and others would believe the reports of the genocide in Europe if this protest was issued and would pressure their governments to do something about it. That would be awful. For Reams, the main problem was public protest in the West, not in Hitler's Holocaust in Europe. His comments on Schultz's information was particularly revealing. For the State Department's Jewish affairs expert, Schultz was the cause of most of the trouble, not the death camps. Reams made his point, and the US version of the protest dropped the assertion, no room for doubts. The three major Allied powers finally issued their first formal protest against Nazi war crimes against Jewish people on December 17, 1942. The three governments reaffirmed their solemn declaration to ensure that those responsible for these crimes shall not escape retribution, and that each state would press on with the necessary practical measures to track them down and try them. Despite this assertion, however, virtually all practical measures by the US and the UK to end Nazi crimes and rescue refugees ground to a halt with the publication of the December 17th protest. The State Department's Theodore Achilles was almost blasé about it. Quote, in due course, our government will no doubt be asked to appoint representatives to sit on a war crimes commission. Unquote. He told staffers in mid-December, but in the meantime, no action was required on the effort. That is chapter 7.
Now, can I ask, there's just so much to unpack. You know, the fact that they don't, how do I want to put this? What they do in their own country should be, that's a reason why a country has a government. They rule over their own government. However, for a group like NATO,
well, this was before NATO.
Right, the precursor is what I'm going to call it. But the League of Nations, to impose its will. However, in this particular case, they were attempting to spread their boundaries and conquer other nations, correct?
So
there's just so much lies. There's so much lies and deception around what took place, why it took place, and there's just so much to unpack.
Well, if you step away from the actual issue, let's even just forget about the war crimes, which is the whole purpose of the chapter, and making it well known that going into World War II, despite what had happened in Armenia, no action was done in those intervening years to make any effort to address crimes against humanity in international law. They had just experienced it in World War I, and they did nothing about it because they didn't want to. So in World War II, what I found the most fascinating takeaway from that chapter is State Department people hiding real intelligence because they wanted a certain policy and could not depend upon the Secretary of State or the President to agree with them. This is that secret government. This is the fifth column. These are the people that have changed the country, and not for the better. They are there, they're implanted there to do specific things, and they make sure those specific things get done. That is unbelievable that you have something like whatever number you want to use, but you have a country in Europe that is going around all of the other countries in Europe and murdering people. And the position of the State Department underground is we're not going to share this information with decision makers. That just, I mean, obviously blew me away. Not that I don't know that it happens, but the documentation, I mean, it's all cited. It's just crazy. These are actual things. And the guy didn't destroy it. He put it in a file because they found it later. That's
right.
That's crazy.
Let's not expose this for what it really is. Let's try and cover it up. And you're right, it sounds just like what our Congress investigations all end up being. Nothing but a giant cover-up.
Yes. Yeah. And they do it to manipulate us. SR 71.
Thank you, Colonel, and thank everyone for attending. And hopefully everybody had a great Memorial Day weekend. Thank everybody on Rumble. I did ask Brock a particular question as to why these were soft pedaled. And I'll read the paragraph summary that Brock gave, if you don't mind.
Go ahead.
It says World War II atrocities were soft pedaled due to Cold War priorities favoring German reconstruction, limited resources to address a vast scale of crimes, legal constraints like retroactivity concerns, selective focus on Axis crimes, and the escape of many perpetrators. The British proposal and the UNWCC laid groundwork for accountability, but political compromises, Soviet exclusion, and economic needs curtailed comprehensive justice, particularly for corporate forced labor.
That's pretty much it. And you
Yes.
can't discount the fact that both the UK and the US had subsidiaries of their companies in Germany that this would have negatively affected. And so a lot of that, the operatives inside the State Department that were operating, again, not on behalf of humanity, the American position in the world, but for corporate minders. That's actually pretty good for Grok. Illini, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Hey, Colonel, thanks for having me up. I don't have a lot to add on the World War II period, at least until we get into Reinhard Gehlen, and then it's interesting.
All bets are off. Yeah. And this book doesn't talk a lot about him. This is really about the foundation of how we ended up with Nuremberg not doing their job. And I found it so well laid out using the documentation of the own people involved in it, their own words. Much of all of this are quotes from them. And whether they came after the fact or whatever, or in meeting minutes that were later discovered, it just was so amazing to me that the going in position was that we can't basically hold them to a standard that's going to blow back on us because we don't want to be bound by that same standard. And that tells you that obviously what we've talked about for a long time, the colonialism that they were currently engaged in and the colonialism that they were going to perpetrate after World War II would have been bound by the same international law against crimes against humanity. And we know, especially in Vietnam, what the US government did. So there's no way in hell that they are going to allow a policy that's going to curtail what they view their very purpose is, which is to enable corporate syndicates to extract resources around the world at any cost as it relates to humanity.
Like United Fruit.
Like United Fruit. Miles?
Yeah, I got a lot of problems with this chapter. I didn't think I would, but two points. As far as moving forward and where people commit crimes every day and what kind of justice system is going to be put in place, I have no idea. You know, some people say it's going to be quantum AI, but I don't know. But then some of the information that came out in that chapter about Germany and what they were talking about, I just got problems with it. That's all I'm going to say.
And I can understand that. There are different versions of history. I'm not even focused on what they're accusing Germany of doing. I'm focused on what our own government did. So our own government took information and suppressed that information and didn't even forward it to the president. And the reason why I was so fascinated by that is because that same stuff was happening in multiple coups around the world, where they selectively fed the president information. Now, some of them 100% was signed off by the president, knowing that they were doing them for corporate interests, like Chile in the 70s. Nixon signed off on that. Eisenhower signed off on Mossadegh's overthrow. But again, in several of even those, I just went through Guatemala again in Wisner's, the book I'm reading on Wisner. They knew there was no communist infiltration. There was virtually no contact with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union didn't have anything to do with Guatemala. And they still sent quote unquote intelligence reports that made it to the president saying that they were communists there. Now, did Eisenhower know that there weren't communists there? Absolutely. But they wanted a piece of paper in a file that said there were, so that they could justify doing what they're going to do in history. And there were some people, according to this book, and they name them, I just don't remember the name off the top of my head. For example, they replaced the ambassador. The ambassador was, and they put that Parafoy, however you say that guy's name, and he shows up in like 4 or 5 different coup places because he's all about that. There were people that were saying there's no communists here. And that's the part that fascinated me. I focus more on what our government's doing, and that crazy guy that he gets even crazier, the legal advisor in the State Department, as you guys will see. Ron, go ahead.
Oh, I just had a very, very big sigh of relief when I heard you say what you said. And I, from the standpoint of our government concealing information, I think that absolutely comports with the fact that that our government, in conjunction with the British government and the Russian government, were working for the international interests for the purposes of laying the foundation of world government. And I'm going to echo what Miles said and leave it at that. But what you said kind of just gave me I exhaled very deeply.
So
thank you.
So here's the irony of all of this. So they want to hide information, and I'm going to draw a correlation here because it's an accurate one. they want to hide information from the American people. They painted the rabbi that spoke as crazy. And they want to hide information because psychological warfare, as you heard mentioned several times in there, was very important to them. And they didn't want the American people to react to the information that they were receiving. And so that goes to the whole Mockingbird media, where they said in that chapter that they were suppressing news, soft pedal it, whatever, because you have to then carry that to the next conflict, which is the Korean War, which we've already proven unequivocally we were lied to in mass about that. Then you take it to the Vietnam. And by that point, Americans were fed up with their war machine. And it really didn't matter what they were doing. They were still going to protest because there was enough information coming back from Vietnam by that point that people could travel more easily. And they understood that what we were doing there was not what our government was telling. And then what did they turn around and do when people are out in the streets and they don't have the, oh my God, we love the military shit going on? They started infiltrating the effective anti-war movement and basically painted them all with the hippie brush and tried to discredit them. And they were infiltrating the National Student Association. They did all kinds of domestic operations. The CIA did domestic operations because they could not handle Americans with knowledge of what was going on that was different than what they wanted us to believe. And we can see over time that this is escalated with every new conflict. The American people has gotten more savvy as far as sharing intelligence, and they've gotten more fascist in shutting it down, to include actually creating the most fascist thing we've ever had in that disinformation outfit. So I see patterns. That's what I see in this book. I see patterns of our own government's behavior that has absolutely nothing to do with living in a republic. Miles, go ahead.
I agree.
Yeah, Miles, go ahead.
So, Ron, you're probably going to understand what I'm going to say more than the audience here. I think these elites, and they've been around for centuries, they do resets. They do history resets. They do human resets. If you look at I think they did a reset from 1870 to 1901. I won't go into how they were doing that, but a lot of it was poisoning politicians. And then when the Rockefellers came on board, they said, well, we can do resets with wars too. And I could never figure out why they were doing the carpet bombing in Europe. They were getting rid of all the buildings. They didn't care about the people. For some reason, they wanted to get rid of all those buildings, especially in Dresden, when they carpet bombed or firebombed Dresden. There was no reason to do that. So I'm trying to figure out, was that just the Rockefellers saying, well, yeah, we can do a reset this way too. So I know that maybe Ron understands what I'm talking about.
Okay. Anybody else? All right. Well, you guys are definitely going to want to watch the show tonight at 9:30. I decided while we're working on this other project to highlight a few of the people that we've come across in the past. We just haven't spent a lot of time on them. So I'm going to start probably what will end up being a 3 or 4 part series with Alpha tonight in highlighting some of our, since y'all just set me up perfect for this, some of the international syndicate members that most people have never heard of. And weirdly enough, the majority of them tie into current events. And they go way back, as was just alluded to. So we're going to highlight one tonight that I know you guys are going to find fascinating, because there are several, thanks to Illini's little magic tool he gave me, people that are associated with this guy that's going to be mind-blowing. It may even take me 2 shows to get through this one guy. There's so much crap there. Miles, go ahead.
Yeah, Colonel, this is for you. Joe Rambo with some other Sean and Anon, they're talking to Mr. Truthbomb, and I'm watching that. I'm kind of multitasking here, and he's they're kind of shooting the shit here, talking about, you know, how he grew up and where he's from and how he got into the movement, stuff like that. I don't know if you've had any personal conversations, but this is an interesting interview with Mr. Truthbomb.
I've actually talked to him on the phone a couple of times. After he gets done with the series that he's doing right now, he is considering doing a series on Operation Gladio. Again, I love him to death, so don't take this the wrong way, but I don't hold my breath when people say that, because a lot of that doesn't come to fruition. However, we did get a shout out on the Joe Rogan show by AJ Gentile, the guy that does the Who Files or whatever that's called. He actually mentioned, so Joe Rogan, after he talked to him about a whole bunch of the different nefarious things the government did that he had done segments on, Joe Rogan asked him, what's the one that, you know, kind of got, and he named Operation Gladio, because remember, several months ago, he did a 45-minute little segment on it. And he definitely did a better job than Clayton Morris did in giving, you know, like literally 10 seconds on what it was. And so I know several of you guys reached out this morning and sent me that, both in the DMs and publicly. If you guys wouldn't mind, I get so many flipping DMs now. It would be so much better if you guys just tagged me and stuff on the main feed there, and instead of sending those kind of things, because that's a very public thing. It's not outing yourself or anything else. So anyway, I was tickled to death. One of you guys had sent it to me and had it like it's queued up so that it just kind of like led right into where he said it. So I'm not sure where in the whole show it's at, but yeah, it was crazy. And I'm like, yes. Renee, go ahead.
Hey, Colonel. Hey, everyone. Always great to be here with you. A comment regarding this chapter, if you don't mind stepping back a little. I just had to
go ahead.
Pull over. Okay, so I'm just trying to piece the understanding and legality of all these organizations, because they were all in cahoots, right? Between the International Court of Justice, the League of Nations, because who voted for all these cats, you know? Like, it was created, the Paris Peace thing and the Treaty of Versailles, and it was like they were all in on it in their own inception, and nobody voted for these guys. Nobody elected these guys, and they just kept building organization after organization to move forward with their plan, right?
Right.
Okay, so it even, I think it was chapter 4 of this book, you bring up, I remember you brought up a point about the comment of I guess one of the industrialists or the investors or something regarding potash in the United States. Well, wasn't that part of the whole goal of infiltrating the Middle East, even before the Balfour Declaration, the British Mandate of Palestine? is because there was like a mother load of potash found in the Dead Sea. I don't know if anyone has ever encountered that.
No, that's true. But Renee, you are making kind of the bigger point of this is all about securing resources. They are the US in the aftermath of World War II was a much bigger presence in Europe than before the World War II. They used World War II for multiple reasons. The Marshall Plan, as we all know, partially funded the stand-up of all the stay-behind units. So now virtually NATO, another one of the things you're pointing out, post-World War II things no one voted on, NATO was going to be able to orchestrate control of all of Europe. And if you didn't go along with them as a head of state, they're going to conduct operations in your country and get rid of you. So it's all about control. Every part of this is about control. You're absolutely right. And resources.
Thank you. I'm just,
sure.
I don't think I ever hear anyone really talk about who voted for these.
Nobody.
How did this get organized, and what was, what is like, follow the dots and go way back? Who's behind this? What's the original intention, and who voted all these fools in?
One world government. I mean, and that's kind of the whole purpose of this. I chose to limit my historical to get a starting point to come forward to the late 1800s with the Fabian Society, which kind of captures, because then right after that, you have the overthrow of the Queen in Hawaii, and that made it personal to the United States, obviously, and come forward. Now, the historians will argue that you can go take this way back, and you can. I'm just not going to. The Fabians, talking about Miles' reset, put it in writing exactly what they were going to do. They were going to create one world government. They were going to use eugenics to basically mass murder people. And they were doing it all to create one world government, a round table to control the world and all the resources. They laid it out in writing. Illini, go ahead.
Hey, Colonel. I guess speaking of countries intervening to have coups, I guess the project that I'm working on right now is to go back through Gladio in the 40s, 50s, and in particular the early 60s in Italy right now. So I mean, I've got the Ganser book, which is kind of interesting, and I've gotten some biographies on the chief of station there from Richard Helms of all people. My question is, if anybody out there has resources beyond the Ganser book on Operation Piano Solo, ideally from journalists, like either Italian journalists, ideally translated into English, or academics, that could be really helpful for me right now, because there's this interesting connection that gets you into the Nixon White House all of a sudden, and a whole bunch of other operations, if we can really nail this one down.
So,
Illini, follow me back, so we can communicate.
Of course. Thanks, Ron.
So I have a website.
I'm embarrassed I haven't done that yet.
I have a website that I use that is a collection that is dealing specifically with quote unquote anti-communist. It's a search thing that I did. And I can go in that collective and see if that's mentioned. And it's like from all kinds of, most of them are all professors that have done research. As a matter of fact, I just got a notice of one today that just because it just keeps reiterating all of the information that it literally just got published. This person had traveled around. It's a college professor, and it is documenting it's another name of another coordination, but it dovetails into the World Anti-Communist League and the one that was set up in Latin America, and the one in Mexico called CAL. And it has even more details of what we already know. It's just fascinating because this person has now, they've got papers that have come out more recently in Argentina and in Uruguay and Paraguay. So they have some of that information in it that has just recently been unearthed. So again, it's fascinating. SR 71, then we'll go to Sean.
Thank you, Colonel. I just wanted to add to Renee's point. What I find just as equally important in all these commissions and how they get formed, who's included is worth the look, but who's not included is also something that you really need to stop and think about. The Soviet Union wasn't included in any of this, and they made sure that happened.
Yeah, yeah, they were doing it all behind their back.
Right.
So it indicates.
It's a valid point.
Yeah, it indicates they had an early intention of turning their machine against them in the immediate aftermath of the war. Sean, go ahead.
Hello, thanks for letting me speak. Yeah. What you're talking about, the whole narrative, is it seems to me it's a lot to do with the Anglo-American empire, because first there was the British Empire, and that ruled the waves, etc. The sun never set on it, and it was a thing which I think that the elite in the Anglosphere, to achieve what they had to achieve, they believed that they had to go beyond Christianity. Christianity was the religion of the West, and it's the religion of good, of turning the other cheek, of love your neighbor, all of that sort of stuff. But the elite in the British Empire, they believed that to have an empire that straddled the world, what they had to do, because there are a lot of bad people out there, evil people out there, they had to turn the way of evil, and they had to adopt a religion which was not a one of peace and love, but of hate and evil. To be more evil than the evil people, you have to be the most evil. So they adopted Luciferianism, Satanism, and that is a big part of the problem we're in at the moment, I think, because the American Empire preceded the British Empire. So we had the Pax Americana, supposedly, and we had the American Empire, which preceded the British Empire. And they were also engaged in the same thing. There are secret societies, they were all Luciferians. So what we are seeing at the moment, with regard to what you're saying about what's happening in the world, they are trying to promote their evil to the rest of the world, to the entire world, because that's what they believe in. It seems to me like that's what's happening, that they're trying to turn the first world, the developed world, into a third world drug cartel hellhole. And that's what's going on, because they believe that might is right and evil is right.
Yeah, I mean, you can't disagree with that because they're doing it right in front of our face. And so in order to generate the mechanism to make all of it happen, they basically built up the West until they got the tools to destroy those very people. Their end state, as they said, was to make all of us enslaved. And they don't want a whole lot of mouths to feed. So that's where the eugenicists come into play. And they want to run the world. And that's where you get the one world government. So yeah, and it's definitely satanic and Luciferian in nature, 100%, because normal people do not think this way. They do not conduct themselves this way. You do not open the floodgates to people and destroy your own countries. You just simply don't do that. But that's exactly what they have done, and enrich themselves while doing it. So,
Sean or Colonel Towner, I can back you guys up a little bit with the Franklin scandal, and of course, the Iran-Contra connection, and then of course, the kids, you get a whiff of Satanism in the whole thing with the original testimony of the kids.
correct.
Are you guys aware of any other resources that basically suggests that, ideally contemporaneous resources from back when the Fabian Society was doing this, or anybody else that kind of points towards, Satanism?
Yes. So one of the very early books that I came across, unfortunately, I'll have to go back and find it because it was only on archive.org. When Cousin It and Bridget and I first started doing this, there is a book that talks about and I got there from looking into, I just thought, again, I didn't know any of this crap 2 years ago. I thought it was weird that the Catholic Church was so used or allowed, in bed with, probably a better word, with Hitler. It just, the whole thing boggled my mind, that they were helping with the rat lines. And then, like Paul Williams says, with the money laundering and all this stuff, that just I'm like, that doesn't make any sense to me. And so I went back and started looking at doing searches on the religious aspect of the senior Nazis. And the word that kept coming up was Gnosticism. Well, I'd never even heard of that. And so I started doing research on mysticism and Gnosticism. And what you quickly find out is that's totally crazy. It's all satanic in nature. They were very, very into it. And this is something that you now see in all of these, everything that Liz does on the Pizzagate and all that other stuff, the symbolism, all of that crap can be traced back to these people. The symbology of it. And I don't know if you guys have ever heard them refer to some kids of stars in Hollywood as moonchilds. Without going into too much depth and detail, that's actually an altar. It's all kinds of crazy shit. They have a sexual ceremony on a particular day that they all believe is going to deliver 9 months later on a particular date, a moon child. And if it actually is born on that date, then they're like some deity in this garbled up garbage. So yes, there's all kinds of craziness, and I'll see if I can try to find that book again, because it was mind-blowing to me. All right. Anybody else have any questions? Josh?
Hey, Colonel. Hey, interesting what you were just referring to as far as the Gnosticism. I've done quite a bit of research over the last few years on this, and you're absolutely right with Project Monarch and these programs that were deeply connected to NATO. What I became fascinated by was what would possibly motivate this. And what's fascinating with history is that there's this pendulum, right? There's usually the provocateur, and then there's a person, and then there's this response, time and time again.
Yep.
So if we were to go back further, right, what I found fascinating was I looked at Hitler's claims, right, and again, he's a criminal, he's evil. I am not in any way. Please do not misunderstand me. I'm not supporting Nazism here. What I was looking at was what was he referring to when he said that communists were Jewish, and I started looking at the Russian Revolution. and you go to these guys that orchestrated basically the Ukrainian
the Bolsheviks.
genocide.
The Bolsheviks.
The Bolsheviks are, the leaders were, 80. The estimates are, are hard to find pinpoint, but it's between 80 to 90%, maybe a little more, were of Jewish descent. Even in the Fabian Society, some of the Sidney Webb and these guys, they are. It's fascinating to see this consistent descent from Judaism, right? And then it goes back into the Talmud and how they do believe the same things. And so what I'm trying to say is that what fascinated me was I looked at what was some of the earliest provocations that took place. And in 1933, I didn't know this, and you can let me know if I'm reading propaganda or if this is real, but this is an actual paper that I came across from the Daily Express in March 1933. There was an international boycott that was taking place in Germany. I can post it in the pill, but basically the international Jewish community was boycotting as in response to the Nazis lying and creating they bombed basically the remind me where they bombed, but they basically it was one of the first. It was when Hitler became a chancellor, and they basically created a false flag.
That's the Reichstag, their parliament. Yeah.
Thank you. So
sure.
they create this false flag event, and then and in response to this, there was this like massive Jewish boycott, right, that I had never read about before. That took place on March 27th, 1933. But what's fascinating is that the U.S. was already aware of this, and they were pushing for this boycott in the U.S. as well, the Jewish community. And in response to this, on April 1st, this is where we get all of these images of the Nazis standing outside saying we're going to boycott the Jewish goods. I had never seen the provocation before that. So my point is very simple. It's that it seemed to me that just as the Germans had not forgotten about the slaughter of 30 million Christians in Ukraine, there's this buildup of tension that took place that was, like you're saying, almost like an arms race for world domination. And you have intel, right? Let's say from your enemy, this is their plan. They are dealing with devils. They are literally communing with entities, right? And what seems to me was taking place is there's this arms race for world domination. Now, who's the provocateur? You can go back, like you said, it goes back very, very, how far do you want to go back? But what clearly starts to happen is you see this pendulum swinging in two extremes. And I think that's what we're dealing with, even with the Nazis in our own country. When we're seeing how they're dancing around with this information, it's almost as if they have sensitive intel that's saying, hey, if we don't do this, we are going to lose the arms race for the world domination. And it's not like one particular group it's a battle for self-preservation, right? You're talking about if we're talking about world domination and you're genuinely referring to this, it makes more sense to me why John F. Kennedy would say Hitler will emerge, right, as a hero of some sort, right? If you have intel like this, I'm not supporting him, and I'm not saying that this is in any way good or bad. I think Hitler was evil. He became evil because he was confronted with evil. And I think there's a response that we must take, that when we are confronted with evil at our doorstep like this, maybe you have intel like this that just says, hey, yeah, these guys are genuinely trying to wipe us out. If we don't do it first, they're going to wipe us out. And I don't know. Over the past 3 years of diligent research on this, it's so interesting that, some of Hitler's claims are true, right? But then you look at the Jewish claims, and they're also true. And one thing that keeps recurring are two primarily interesting things to me, is that you do have an overrepresentation of Luciferian Talmudic Jews in these positions. And I don't know what that means. I have no idea what that means. But it's very fascinating to see that still seems to be playing out today. but I'll leave it there. I thought that was very fascinating because I wanted to know what would possibly motivate this insanity. There's no, there are dark tetrads, right? They're these like psychopaths, but it's like, how could there be so many that just are constantly fighting? Basically a ghost. What are they doing? What are they fighting? What are they doing it for? What is it? Just power, or is it in response to unseen provocations?
Well, let me just say that the book that I was reading, the senior leadership of the Nazi Party and Hitler as well, their mystic Gnosticism adherence goes back well before he was ever made chancellor. So it is a long history that was in several of the leadership of the Nazi Party. Patrick Jonas, go ahead.
Colonel, and looking in some other books, one called The Secret Founding of America by Nicholas Hager. He has a chapter on the founding of the German Illuminati by Adam Weishaupt, was the son of a Jewish rabbi who became a Jesuit priest. And he worked with Charles de Lorraine and the Rothschilds and was trying to form a secret society, as he had trained in a bunch of pagan religions, and with Pythagoras, the Kabbalah, the Essenes, and the major key of Solomon and lesser key of Solomon, and a bunch of things like that. And he was in the 1772 and 1773. He became the dean of the Faculty of Law somewhere, and then he started to work with the Rothschilds. And in
he was
found that nobody was satanic enough for him or demonic enough, so he had to form his own organization, and working through all those people and the Freemasons, he had this Illuminati that he established in the 1770s, and their revolutionary goals were the abolition of all ordered government, abolition of private property, abolition of inheritance, abolition of patriotism, abolition of all religion, abolition of the family, abolition of marriage, and creation of a world government.
Right. It basically was, and that's why I'm saying you can take this back as long as you want. There's always going to be one of these people. I just stopped at the Fabian Society because it kind of encaptures all of it. I'm well aware of him and his infiltration of the Masonic orders in Europe. And that was actually exposed in 1776 when one of a satchel that he had his book in got exposed, and led to a whole bunch of repercussions as a result of that. So yeah, thank you.
And then Cecil Rhodes was trying to do the same thing. His book, Paul Williams, one of his other books called The Killing of Uncle Sam, talked about Cecil Rhodes having
that's the Fabian Society.
Form a secret society, and they had the same kind of crazy things, but they said they would never get married, and they started becoming pederasts and some other kinds of satanic things.
Yep.
It never ends.
It never ends. You're right. Warhamster, did you want to say anything?
Hey, a couple comments. First of all, we always talk about, we've been talking about the Fabians and how they brought their ideology, they jumped the Atlantic and joined with our own robber barons. That's one of the things we've been hitting on.
Yep.
All these ideologies, Hegel. You start with Hegel, and you can build everything forward from there. So that was one point. The other is, I think Josh was asking about, how the fact that the Bolsheviks were overly influenced by Jews. The numbers are often overstated online. I can get you some source documents that are probably the best, most accurate I can see. But the Soviets, the original Politburo, and I'm going to have the number wrong, it was one below half, so either 7 out of the 13 members, 6 out of the 13 or 7 out of the 15 were actually Jewish. And there's a reason for that, and that's because Zionism and Marxism stem their fruits of the exact same tree.
Yep.
It all flows through Hegel. And you get Marx, you get a lot of other thought thinkers. We can't go through them all today, but there's a reason for that. And I just tell people to be very cautious that there's a difference between Jews and Zionists.
100%.
And that the Zionist philosophy came right out of London. And yeah, that did have some Rothschild influence to it. So, who was financing these studies back in the day and these institutions of higher learning? It's a huge web. We're going to try to get through once we jump across the pond to the Fabians. But Hegel's where you got to start. And I would tell anybody, if you really want to understand this one world government, new world order mentality, start with Hegel.
Yep. Good point. All right. Anybody else? Okay. That's it. Tune in 9:30 tonight to Alpha Warrior Show. Warhamster and I will be on tomorrow at noon, and we will all.
Yeah, it's going to be a doozy tomorrow. I think it'll be our best show.
Everyone owns our best show. They just keep getting better. So we also just scheduled a pop-up sit rep for Friday at 11, which we will send you details out about. And it's going to be Ghost of Base Patrick Henry, Warhamster, and myself on a show together, which is going to be amazing. I'm really, really looking forward to that. So anyway, anybody else? Nope. All right. You guys take care. The thunder just rolled in, so my Starlink probably isn't going to work much longer. Thank you all for being here. Take care. Okay. What do we got going on over here? Still kicking. Oh, let's see. Okay. Hello, everybody over here on Rumble. You guys are so active in the chat. I love it. All right. It's scary that the International Syndicate and Trump both. Yeah, I don't know that they both want a North American Union, but we'll see. He says a lot of things to be very confrontational to get reactions. Go Lafayette. Yep. Goes right back to Adam and Eve. All right, guys, take care. I'm going to jump up here so I can go to my Wednesday family dinner. Y'all take care.